I moved to Baltimore in the summer of 2011 and quickly got to work exploring it by bicycle, my favorite way to see a city. The Fallsway cycle track went in just 6 months later, and I had a protected bike lane heading downtown and to points east. I've ridden that cycle track literally hundreds of times over the past 10 years, and every time I am reminded that right here in the center of the city is a prison complex, cells caging so many of our neighbors in a vain attempt to arrest ourselves out of social disorder. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In this short video, I want to take you on a tour of Baltimore's prisons and jails, all grouped together just east and in the shadow of the Jones Falls Expressway. The complex includes the Chesapeake Detention Facility, a supermax prison that houses federal pretrial detainees, the Maryland Transition Center, or MTC, formerly known as the Maryland Penitentiary, a maximum security pretrial detention center, the Baltimore City Detention Center, formerly the Baltimore City Jail, that is a prison for women only after the men's wing was closed and demolished, and the Baltimore City Correctional Center, a minimum security facility that houses around 500 men. These buildings and the facilities required to make them go are one of the 20 largest detention centers in the United States and one of the oldest. There are cages for 4,000 people here, and I think of them as I pedal slowly up the hill, looking up at tiny windows, thinking about the efforts made to ensure inside stays separate from outside at all times. Prisons and jails have become so normal, the logic that we deal with harm by locking people up so ubiquitous, that it is sometimes hard to remember that we have not always had a prison complex in downtown Baltimore. Prior to the 1800s, harm was dealt with differently, with physical punishment and fines being most common. The rise of prisons accompanied that of other total institutions, as historian David Rothman calls them. Penitentiaries, schools, asylums, and almshouses all represented the rise of disciplinary power that from one perspective was more humane than corporal punishment, but also represented the growth of disciplinary power that moved into every cell of the individual and social body in a time of revolutionary upheaval and reorganizations of society. Baltimore City Jail was first built in 1801, and it was rebuilt in 1859. The MTC opened in 1811 as the Maryland Penitentiary, the first prison in the state and the second of its kind in the country. Baltimore, again, a city of firsts. The Maryland Penitentiary was much smaller when it opened than it is today. Men and women were housed separately and were kept apart from each other. Historical reports suggest people lived in decent conditions with food, conditions that would change and be challenged in the future. After the Civil War, the prison was investigated for poor working and living conditions, and money, quote, earned by incarcerated people for their labor was used not for the prison or the people in them, but returned to general state coffers. In the 1900s, new reports came out challenging the punishments and conditions at the penitentiary. Concerns including punishing people by hanging them slightly above the ground by their wrists, cells that were like dungeons, and bedding that was bloody from ubiquitous bedbug bites. Food was stolen by guards as inmates went hungry, fed rotten meat that wasn't refrigerated. Similar complaints were found at the city jail. Starting in 1885, the Baltimore Sun reported poor conditions, and in 1938, many Baltimore residents, according to the Sun, were calling for the building to be demolished and replaced with a new facility. Others complained that the jail didn't offer rehabilitation services and left people in wretched conditions. The 1960s and 70s saw challenges to racial segregation in the prison and jail, and they also saw the rise of inmate resistance to incarceration itself. Though there was always resistance. One example is the 1920 uprising at the penitentiary that brought in a new and more forceful warden. Uprisings took place in 1966, 1972, 1984, and 1988. The response to these was largely increased power and control rather than changing the system itself. A 1979 ruling set a one-person per cell limit that led to building more and more beds, but capacity couldn't keep up with arrest rates. Baltimore City Jail saw its population rise to 3,000 by 1989, gross overcrowding that then Mayor Kurt Schmoke declared an emergency. Since then, the emergencies have continued, including a class action case against the state in 2003, claiming cruel and unusual punishment for the jail's refusal to provide basic health care, decent living conditions, and even just sinks and toilets that worked. BCDC was ultimately closed, and incarcerated people moved to other prisons around the state. MTC no longer houses death row inmates, and its lethal injection table and gas chamber are no longer used. The warden's house at MTC has not yet been demolished, and historical preservationists are fighting to keep this true. These buildings are part of an ugly and complicated history and present, and keeping them there, I would argue, reminds us of the ways incarceration has embedded itself into our built environment and consciousness. The Chesapeake Detention Facility no longer keeps incarcerated people from interacting with each other or confined to their cells for 23 hours, the usual MO for a supermax facility. Changes have happened, but none of them get to the heart of it, building a world without prisons in the first place. There is no way to decorate the cage enough to make this right. When I first moved to Baltimore, resistance to these practices was in full effect as organizers fought to prevent the building of a new youth jail. Every new bed is one that must be filled, so keeping new facilities from opening is one strategy to stopping mass incarceration. A new facility was eventually built to comply with a federal order, but organizers learned a lot from that experience. The struggle is ongoing, and a win should be celebrated, even as we know wins can be temporary. Organizers also work to mitigate the effects of incarceration. Baltimore Action Legal Team, for example, offers a community bail fund for those who cannot afford to buy themselves out of pretrial detention. Their jail court support program runs a 24/7 hotline and provides care to people upon their release. They also connect people with legal and administrative support. This is just one organization working to improve lives, not by making the cages a little cleaner, a little less crowded, but by building a world where people aren't kept in cages at all. The history of Baltimore's correctional campus shows us that we have not always organized ourselves against harm in this way, and that there are other ways to address harm. These ways include ensuring everyone's basic needs are met, building systems of restorative justice and care that address harm on both individual and structural levels, and doing the work to change our minds that too often think caging is the only answer. If it were, we'd have things answered by now, and we don't. Let's use this history to keep thinking differently about the world we want, because the world we have, it isn't the only possibility.